God, I really didn't sleep well last night, so I'm really kind of out of it. Next finals week, right, is when your papers are due, and that Friday, I want them that day, right? By the end of the day, because I'll grade them over the weekend. Grades are due on Monday, so I will not take them late. Okay? Period. Right? If they come in late, it's a 0. Simply because I can't do that with my weekend. Okay? I mean, I have to have grades in by noon on Monday. Okay? So, no late papers accepted. Unless you catch on fire or something like that, and you email me before it's due. Right, and then we'll figure out a way to give you an incomplete. I bet I was the last person you wanted to see while you were waiting in line to get drinks. On Friday, as I was leaving class over here at the Saints Fest thing. I bet I was the last person you wanted to see, having not been to class but had plenty of time for that. Yeah. Well, anyway, okay, so on Friday of next week, we'll have a potluck. What I'd like everybody to do is, especially those of you who have special dietary needs, bring stuff. Everybody should just bring something with enough to feed like maybe 3 other people. Bring enough for 4 or 5 people, right? If we all do that, rather than we all bring enough for 12 people, then there'll be more than enough, right? Try to keep it to finger food. That way, I'll have some plastic plates and whatnot, but we should avoid things that are messy. Non-recyclable. Sorry. Well, we'll see what we can do. What's available at the Safeway, right? I'll do my best to be green as I can that way. And I'll bring a little bit more than that, right? I was planning on trying to make bitterballen this weekend, and I might try to make some vegan bitterballen as well to see if it's a way to thicken almond milk, right? And maybe even try to do a gluten-free bitterballen for those who are gluten-free as well. So, but at the same time, don't rely on the stuff that I'm going to bring for it. Everybody brings stuff for 4 people. That ought to do it. And then whatever you want to drink, right? However, I cannot serve alcohol here when there's people under 21. It's You have wine in the morning? Is that what you said?
Wine in one of my econ classes.
We'll see. I will see. I'll do some double checking. If your recon class did it, I don't want to get fired. Yeah. I'm too old to get. There's a thing in the Times this morning about ageism, right? I'm getting another job from you would be very. It took me long enough to get this one, right? I was on the market for 10 years before I got this job. So anyway, so that's it for Friday next, right? And we're at 3:00 rather than 3:30 on Friday of test week. Right, it's 3 to 5:30, and people will just, we'll talk about stuff. We'll look at pictures from the trip. If you haven't uploaded your photos from the trip to that Google Drive site, I sent everybody a link to that site way back, right? And I see that the vast majority of the pictures that are there are mine. So, put your pictures up there and we can take a look at them, right? And we'll have some other things that we do, okay? So that's the long and the short of that. I wanted to continue talking about genre pictures for the last 2 classes. I had ideally wanted to go get into landscape some more than I did, but we're not going to simply have the time to do that. There's too much material to try to cover in the course of a semester, really, even if we're limiting ourselves to pictures in these few museums. So we were looking at Nicholas Moss a week and a half ago, and this picture from the National Gallery of a woman dozing over a book, a Bible no less, holding her glasses in her hand. And we were looking, as I've asked you guys to do with your research, look at other works that are similar to see if they help us understand our picture any better, right? And there's this one on the left that's in Brussels, which is very much the same theme, but adds to it with some other elements, repeats some elements like the keys on the background. It's the same model in both of them. Nicholas Moss had just come out of Rembrandt's shop. He was a pupil of Rembrandt. And remember how Rembrandt used his mother as a model. We think Maas might have used his own mother as a model, following the example of Rembrandt, because we know that Rembrandt used his paintings and his prints as a teaching tool, right? And so if we look at the one from Brussels on the left, we see things that help us understand the one on the right. The idea of the glasses being taken off. She's been reading and now is not. But it adds to it with the lace making, which we'll see as a recurring theme in Maas's work and elsewhere, as a sign of diligence usually, because lace making requires a significant amount of attention and diligence to the task, because you're flipping those bobbins around and weaving the lace. And so one way to interpret this is as a neglect of duty. The book is a Bible. We see pretty much the same Bible in both of them with the marginal notes, even though we can't read it. In the one on the left, Maas gives us the exact book of the Bible. We can see that it's open to the book of Amos in the Old Testament. Sorry?
Do you think it's a symbol of affluence as well?
Not for the lace maker, right? Because a lace maker is no, not in this picture. There's nothing else there to say it, right? I think depending on the lace and the person and portraits and whatnot, then yeah, certainly. But I hope you're not listening to music and just leaving it there because it's comfortable. As NBA playoffs or something like that.
No, it just feels good on my end.
Okay. Good. I'm glad to hear it. Dina, if you can hear music coming out of that, you're going to let me know.
Yes.
Right?
Well, I am the closest to me.
I know,
so
that's right. And on the speaker side, no
I'll
less.
be her personal moderator.
All right, very good. Excellent. So, okay, the book of Amos, right, talks about the fact that little sins are every bit as bad as big sins. Right? That's what happens in the first book of Amos, where God gets all pissed off at the children of Israel because they keep messing up, right, on their travels, and he says, I'm going to punish the small sins with the same fierceness as I punish the big sins. And so this idea of falling asleep on the job might not seem like a big deal, but the point is, of course, that it is a big deal, right? When we were looking at various representations of sloth, one of the 7 deadly sins, we often find in prints themes treated in series. And in this case, this is number 7 of the 7 deadly sins. It's even numbered at the bottom, right? And when we see images of sloth, the sin of sloth, right? Laziness. We always see it with your hand resting on... and Jorge pulls his hand away from his head. Your hand resting on your head. The inscription at the bottom comes from one of the apocryphal books, the Wisdom of Sirach or Ecclesiasticus. It basically says, don't be impatient as you look for knowledge. Right? In other words, don't be diligent, right? Don't give up in your search for knowledge. Right? And so that's something that we have to think, for us, keep in our minds that's something that would have been on people's minds in the 17th century, looking at images like Nicholas Maas. I brought in also a Bruegel print. Bruegel did lots of prints in series. Designed them, and someone else would carve the plate himself. So he would give these drawings to his publishing house, and they would turn around and have professional engravers carve them. Right. So the Hieronymus Koch Publishing House, Bruegel created this, and then Peter Vanderheyden engraved it for him. And this is, again, part of a series of the 7 deadly sins. Again, the sin of sloth. And you can find her in the foreground sleeping in the same sort of position, right? This gives us context for what to look at with these. And you, in fact, find sleeping figures in that position elsewhere in the same print, right? So it's sloth, and again, being tempted by demons while you're here, and that this is a much more secularized version of kind of the same thing, right? And then I think we saw this at the end of class 2 weeks ago, the idle servant, where Maas makes it very obvious what's going on. She's a servant in this household. I don't know if it's a public venue or not, right? Whether she's a bad waitress or if she's a bad servant in a nicer house, right? He doesn't give us enough clues to tell us what's going on. Are the figures in the back like our De Hoek figures, people, entertaining and drinking, or are they just have their friends over, They still got that pub game glass there. But here it is, right? Look, can you believe it? And they're sleeping right on the job. One of my grad students, Alec, who you might remember from the trip, right? Talked about the candlelight figure. Asked if the age difference meant anything. And I thought that was a really interesting question because everybody talks about these in one breath, right? And a young woman servant, he suggested, might mean something very different than an older woman sleeping, right? That on the one hand, one can be seen as someone who's got stuff that they're supposed to be doing, and the other one is someone who, at the end of their life, maybe deserves a rest. I kind of thought that was an interesting way of looking at it. I don't have an answer for it, but I thought, well, age should make a difference with these, right? In how we interpret them. We saw a Nicholas Moss when we were in the conservation center, and sorry, Olivia, but I have to. Because talking about sleeping figures and whatnot, right? Yeah, exactly. And there you are. But at least you didn't have your hand on your arm, right? You're gonna have a legacy at Marymount. This is staying in the pictures, right? From this point forward. And well, there she is. I know, and he's into it, right? And but there you are. And so the question with this one is, do we read this one the same way? Right, there's a woman saying grace. Well, how do you read this? I mean, she certainly, it's the same model, right? And it's almost like he's got the exact same drawing. You just keep sort of shading the face somewhat differently from the same drawing. What do we do with this one? First things first, what do we see in this that we've seen in other Moss pictures? Jorge.
Hanging keys.
The hanging keys, right? So keys are a sign of attentiveness, right? And so, in a picture like this, with your eyes closed next to the keys, suggests that someone could break in, right? So we definitely have the keys as key, so to speak, right? What else do we see here that we've seen in other Mosses or in this one here? Look on the shelf. There's an old book, probably another Bible. It doesn't look like the same one, right? Looks smaller. But there's a book, and it's propped open as well in the same way, right? We saw the hourglass that's back there. The red hourglass on the wall was actually propping up the book in the Brussels picture where she's got the lace next to her, right? So he's got a lot of the same elements, kind of like our still life painters are reappearing here, right? Now, the question is, do we read it the same way? Do we read it as another image of potentially of sloth? Is she praying, or has she done what my dad used to always do when he would go to church and use the prayer time for a little nap? Right? What do you think? Any clues?
I think for this woman,
Mm-hmm.
can you go back
Yeah.
to the slide? I think for this woman, she's probably sleeping
Uh-huh.
because, I mean, I can sort of tell because her eyes are closed and she's like
Right.
doing in a position where it looks like she's studying, but in reality
She's sleeping.
she's kind of
So
tired.
what about the Rijksmuseum picture then?
For this one, it looks like as if they are praying
Yeah,
because
because her head
they've
is
got their hands
right.
together and they're like kneeling and
Not leaning.
well, not exactly.
well, not really, because her elbows are on the chair, right? Her elbows are on the arms of the chair.
Yeah, but
So-
it looks like she's praying, but in reality she's not.
Yeah. Well, this is what the Rijksmuseum says, right? Their sort of blurb on the picture says that she's so deep in prayer that she has lost sight of the cares of the world around her, right? So she has a meal. She's got a nice salmon steak, right? Some bread and some cheese. I don't know if that's porridge or what in that bowl, right? But we've got some nice cheese on the corner here, and we got the kitty cat, right? Who's about to steal it, right? And is in fact already sort of pulling the tablecloth away from the woman, right? So that the cheese is right on the edge and the knife is sticking out over the edge, and that standard still knifes her away, right? So the question is she being, is it a sign is it a positive sign of diligent prayer? Or is it potentially that she's too caught up in that to not even realize what's going on around her, right? And I think with a lot of our genre scenes, what we end up finding is that they really do end up leaving things open enough that we could take it multiple ways, depending on what you want to do with it, right? That they're meant to be conversational pieces. In the same way I'm asking you, what do you think? I think viewers in the 17th century would have done very much the exact same thing, right? Not everybody in a Moss picture is sort of out of touch, right? In one way or another. We have very diligent people in Nicholas Moss's images as well, young and old lace makers diligently bobbing their lace. And the picture on the left, I just love this picture on the left. Really, really cute. In fact, where is that? The one on the left is, it should say, I think, hang on a second. Now, this one's on the Met on the left, up in New York, right? But the kid just sort of looks like a little king there, and she's attentively, diligently singing to him as she does her work with her scissors hanging from a thread there. Seated by the open window with the city outside, very much like other pictures we've seen in the front window of the house, right? Attentively sort of at the gateway between public and private, right? A nice close-up of her busily making that lace, and then our cute little kid in his high school. And I think that on a certain level, this is also about diligence, but maybe not so much, because he's knocked all the stuff off of his stool, right? And pushed these things out of the way, his little metal cups and whatnot. And he's done eating, and so they put that down on the ground, but he's now like pushed things off of there and knocked them over. Shelley.
So still, children aren't usually like, especially when they're that small, just sitting there.
Yeah.
It kind of does.
I know there's something I think there's something that he's doing with that child to make him look like a regal, like a prince or something, you know, to give him that sense of attitude, without the sort of squirminess that we see. We'll see it later. The sick child that we saw in the Rijksmuseum on the mother's lap, and he's just sort of splayed out, right? Has more of that sense. This almost looks like it could be a walker, doesn't it? That he's standing in. It's not, though, because it's just his little high chair, right? Yeah.
If it weren't for the knocked over cup and all of that, I would have thought,
Yeah. Well, the hat is the hat that we've seen before. When you're teaching children how to walk, right? That's that little bumper hat, right? So the area around the outside is padded, so that when he falls over, like Lisa Simpson, he won't bang his head on the ground around him. But just the way he's got, look what he's got a little roll in one hand and he's got a spoon in the other. And that adds to that sense, because when you see images of princes, right, they're carrying a scepter and they're usually carrying an orb, right, in their hands as symbols of royalty. And it's sort of a secularized royalty.
Is that kind of, it kind of seems like when that's not the mother, that might be a servant taking care of the child.
Say it again.
That
Louder.
might be like a servant, the young lady.
Oh, that's
instead
a
of the child, instead of the mother.
I wish Margaret were here, because she's doing, with the Vermeer picture of the servant with the woman getting the letter. Since I've been looking at these a lot and putting these slideshows together, I've been really interested in what costume tells us about people. And this is something that we were talking about a little bit yesterday, right? What does the costume tell us about these different people? And is she a servant of the household versus the mother of the child?
Right.
That's the question, right? And if I had tons of time, I'd go through and do a really thorough sort of costume study of things. What are they doing? And what could we compare her to? This is how you'd answer the question, right? You would look at the bonnet and that and see if you find ladies of the house wearing that, or if that's only servants of the ladies of the house that wear that, right? And even if she is a servant, at what point were servants allowed to have children and keep them in the house of the employer, right? There are lots of questions that come up with that, right? But one of the first thing you have to do is to figure out how to read the costume, right? Which I don't know how to do, and I wish I did. Right? While we were in the conservation center, we saw another Moss of these dutiful servants, if you will, dutiful domestic women looking into the crib of the child with her book and sort of paying very much closer attention to him. So there's a whole range of these things. With this one, I wanted to point to something which I meant to bring slides to show it, but I didn't. Is the fake curtain that's painted over the top of it, which is really kind of cool, right? There's a curtain rod painted. It's not even; it's sort of bent and rustic, and then there's this purple curtain that hangs in front of it. And it goes back to two different themes that are worth mentioning here. And one of them is that paintings were often stored underneath curtains instead of glass, right, to protect them, and then pulled back to look at. We find lots of pictures where we see them displayed inside of households this way. But the other thing goes back to a sort of an artistic feat of strength, if you will. Painting the curtain so that you, looking at the picture, really can't determine whether you're looking at a picture or something else that is fooling your eye into thinking that something is real when in fact it's painted, right? So if we think about the curtain, it's the threshold between our space and the painted space. But he then makes us question what we're actually looking at, right? And instead of just painting a picture, he's creating something real, ostensibly, right? And there is, in fact, a old Greek myth about a painter who painted a curtain, and people were fooled to try to pull it back, and it proved what a great painter he was, right? And so that certainly seems to fit in with what Nicholas Moss is doing here. Around this exact same time, 1650s or so, there's a Rembrandt painting of the Holy Family with a fake curtain painted over the top of it as well. I meant to bring that in, and then just plumb forgot. What do you think about the baby in red?
Yeah.
What do you mean?
Like, why are they both they have the same color red?
I'm sorry, say that a
They
bit.
have the same color red.
In all of the different paintings, you mean? Or it seems like it, and that would be a question for our conservators, right? Because they've done the chemical analysis to know whether or not it is the same painting in all of these, or whether it's one of the things to be aware of is to draw conclusions from this picture, because how many times removed are we from the work of art? In addition to that, this one is under natural light in the conservation studio and partially cleaned. And this one is provided to us by the Metropolitan Museum staff, photographed under different conditions with a different camera and so forth, right? So when I'm putting these pictures together, I don't bother to color scale and color gauge them that much. I sort of do it by what I remember it looking like, right? So that's a great question to ask, right? In addition to that, another question to ask is color symbolism, right? What does red mean to them? And certainly there are standard traditional things that red means, and have certain associations. This has royalty, for example, right? But also sort of feelings, right? Because of its association with blood. But what did it mean to a viewer in the 17th century? And there are a few things out there on this, right? Gerard ter Borch, who we're going to look at next, his sister was a painter, amateur. She didn't belong to the guild, right? Sketch artist, also a poet, and she has a book on color symbolism that she wrote. This is what colors mean. I don't know the degree to which that's personal or more widely held, right? But that's out there. This brings us closer now to what you just brought up about the children looking like kids, Shelley. I think in both of the Moss here, we get that sense of a real, really not looking as posed and frozen. And this is the one I was just talking about, this wonderful Metsu of the sick child who's squirmy on the mother's laps. I would think, Maeve, going back to your question, to answer it even a bit more, is that they're all buying their paints from the same people, right? They're buying the raw ingredients from an apothecary and grinding up things in the studio themselves. So the chances of them having the same colors is the same as an art student today, right? Buying Winsor Newton, right, or Grumbacher or whatever, to end up with very much the same tones in everything we see. But these scenes of dutiful mothers are obviously multitude. We saw some with Peter de Hooch 2 weeks ago when we were last looking at these pictures, and both with Moss and Metsu we see them as well. I want us to try to read a picture by Metsu because I think this is kind of an interesting case study with this one down at the National Gallery. So, what's going on with this picture? Hey, let's read the narrative. Let's look at what's happening here. Forget. Yep. Okay, so we got this guy barging in, right? And what was the second thing you said, babe?
She's getting out of bed.
Okay. But you said trying to keep him out. Did you say that as well?
No, the maid is.
Yeah. So the guy bursting in. Let's start with the right. So we got this guy bursting in. He's got his hat off, and we got this woman who's trying to keep him out, right? And looking over her shoulder, she's pushing him away. Okay. But he's just come through the door, right? And then there's a woman in the middle at a bed. Right? Maeve said getting out of bed. You agree? Getting into bed?
Your foot is. No. Because you don't back up in the bed. You don't put your butt on.
So you think she's coming out rather than
You don't
stepping
put your
back?
foot step back.
Okay. This is it. Do people agree?
She knows what she's doing. I don't know. I think you can read it both ways.
Yeah. Well, okay, one of the things that's interesting about this, and I have some details to show you, right, this way, is what she's not wearing and what she is wearing. And this is an important part of it, right? And certainly with her foot there next to the shoe, it's almost as if she's trying to slide her foot into the shoe. But you'll notice that is the shoe for the other foot that's next to her foot, right? So right? Do you read it? So the foot that's down should be catching the shoe that's closer to us.
So maybe she's going in the bed.
I don't.
No, that's why she's getting out. She's all in the
She's
bed.
kicked the shoes away from her feet, right? There's definitely that because they don't line up with the feet that she's kicked. So she's not just slipped out of her shoes, right? They've been laying there. Now,
And a sock.
sorry,
Sock.
I don't think it's a sock. I think those are. I don't think so. I'll look at the details. So her clothes are laying over there, right? She's in her slip. Okay. The dress that we see on the right and that top coat that we see on the right, we've seen a lot of pictures. This fur-lined top coat. There's tons of pictures, and you've seen a lot of these in your Van Mieris's, right? But we see them elsewhere. Lots of women are wearing these sort of ermine-lined coats, and the lining comes sort of around your shoulders, down the front, and then cuts around the back. And the other red dress there, so that's the coat that's laying on the chair. To the right of that is the skirt. And we know that because of the gold, right? Those 3 stripes of gold that come down, or 4 stripes of gold, will come down the front of the skirt and then split around the hem, right? It's a very nice dress, and we've seen it in other pictures. You may not have noticed it, but we've seen it, and I think I've got some examples. So she's half-dressed, okay? So that might support what Maeve is suggesting. One of the things that a costume historian did with this one was that the one thing she hasn't taken off yet is that red thing that she's wearing. So the slip that she's wearing comes all the way to the top, right? And over the top of it, she has that red bodice, pink bodice on it still. That is apparently stiff,
Yeah.
right? And then you can see her body's pretty rigid within it, but I mean, it is like hard, right? It's like a corset, right? So it's not the sort of thing that you would wear to bed. It would be something you would take off before you got into bed. So if she were laying down already, it would be highly unlikely she'd still be wearing that, unless something else is going on, which is actually here. This is a really fun picture, actually, because the more we look at it. So, okay, the guy's coming through the door. There's the woman getting in bed. And do you think that's why the woman's trying to keep him out? It's like, hey, private area. Maybe, right? What do we do with the look on the woman in pink's face? Say it.
She's not very serious. She looks like taking it back. But she's not even. I don't feel like she's.
So which she are you talking about?
The woman, the main woman.
In the woman in white and pink. The look on her face, she's not shocked. She's not ashamed. There's actually kind of expressionless, right? Like
She's leaning away from him. She's like, why are you here?
leaning away from him.
Yeah.
So possibilities of what are you doing here, okay? And it is the intruder after all, right? He's burst in, and her servant to the right is keeping him out. So is there something like, but there's nothing really dramatic about her facial expression. What about the other woman? She's smiling at it, isn't she, right? And can you see what she's doing there? She's got a card. She's got a letter in her hand, and she's sitting at a table. And at the table, it's a toilet, right? The way they used the term in the 17th century, so a crapper, right? It's a mirror and makeup stand, right? And I have a detail. We can see her reflection in the mirror, right? And what she's doing is she's got a makeup brush, and she's putting makeup on her chin, right? That's why her hand is like this, okay? So, now other details. What about the dog? That's right. So there's some sort of palace intrigue going on here, right? He's coming through the door, and he's sort of saying, here I am, and, you should be pleased to see me. And he's doffed his hat somewhat politely as he bursts his way in, and his hands are sort of out to the sides as he's bursting into this room, right? And the question comes up, as we look at it more closely, is we've already talked about what's she up to, what does she believe in. There's no socks here now, we can see, right? At least not around the shoes themselves. And that look on her face is sort of, the more I look at it, the more it's kind of like, mad?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That kind of thing.
Yeah. And what's interesting about it is that her friend, right, is exact opposite. So there really is a play between these two reactions, right? And I think on a certain level, the woman in the center has no idea this guy's coming in. But when I look at her, I think she knows. And she's getting ready for it, right? If this is bedtime, what's she doing putting on makeup? Right? She knows someone's coming as she's there dolling herself up. So there's some sort of intrigue, like she's maybe, and she's got a letter, right? She's got a note in her hand. We don't know what it says, but there's some little folded up card in her hand, right? Or no, wait, take it back. That's a comb, isn't it? That's not a letter. That's a comb. Well, I take it all back. I thought there was print on the outside of the letter, but no, that's a dual-sided comb. So she's been primping, right? And the mirror tells us that she's been making herself pretty. So one of the questions that comes up then is, who's the intruder there to see? I mean, we assume immediately that he's there to see the woman in white. But maybe he's not. Right? Maybe he's there to see the woman in green. Again, these are open-ended questions, right? Around this. Now, let's see. The clothing, right? We see it. There's a Metsu with the same clothing, right? She's got an apron over the top of it, but it's the exact same top coat. And down at the bottom, I can't see it because of the light in the room, but the gold banding I was talking about goes just by her shoe there at the bottom, right? And in this case, the hunters come in and, do you want a dead bird? And we know what birding means. We've talked about that before as an erotic overtone, right? And Cupid. I think it looks like Mercury, actually. The statue does, with the arm up. But it would be worthwhile investigating that a bit further, right? And this motif of the guy breaking into the room, right, is something that we've seen a long tradition of, right? So Metsu is certainly taking a standard tradition. He's playing with it. The detail that's easy to miss, right? There's a key in the door. Can you see it?
I can see it.
Yeah?
It's kind of well hidden.
It is, right? But right above that means that someone unlocked the door. Right? He didn't, because the key is on the outside, right? So the door is open in toward us, and the key closes out, okay? That means the maid didn't open the door and he came pushing his way in. That means the maid left the key in the door or someone left the key in the door for him, right? So this is an expected arrival on everybody's part except maybe the woman in the center. He could have a key to the room, but the fact that he's being pushed out suggests that maybe that he doesn't belong. Right? The bottom line is he has access to this room. He's either has it himself, as Maeve suggests, or he's been given it by someone inside the room. Right? And the picture ends up having sort of this possibility of being read in multiple ways, right? Which is common for a lot of these genre scenes, right? And again, the point is that they're open to conversation, right? They're open to different ways of looking at it. Say, I don't know, what about that? What about that? And then also with this hidden key, this idea of inviting you to spend more time with it, inviting you to look at it more closely and discover things that you might not have seen at first, right? And then our little dog, right, seems to recognize this guy and understand what's going on. Right? Now we've got another picture of the National Gallery that also is full of the same sort of questions, right? And they usually hang these right next to each other in the gallery. Ter Borch, who we've seen before, fantastic with satin. Got some nice details of this, right? But look at the dogs in both of these. It's almost the same kind. It's almost the same breed, right? And it plays a very similar role in that it's curious, right? It doesn't know what's going on. But he's looking in a different direction. He's not looking at the man. He's now looking at the woman in the center, right? So as we look at this picture, we've got this guy again coming through the door. Standard traditional theme, right? The lover comes through the door to a woman inside a room, okay? And going back to Molinar and earlier, this is a common theme. But just like The Intruder by Metsu, the question is there more to it than that? Who's he there for? How does this group of 4 people work out? Right? So look at the table. We've got a girl playing a lute in blue. We've got an unplayed viola, cello laying on the table, right? With a chair that's been kicked out a bit. Suggests that the woman in satin has just stood up from the chair. Or the chair is set up waiting for someone to sit down. Again, we don't know which way, right? But the question is, who was playing that cello? Or who's going to be playing that cello? And that's the thing that Ter Borch doesn't tell us. Right? Who's going to sit down and make music with the girl in blue? Is it the fellow coming through the door? Again, same gesture, right? Hat off. Is it the fellow behind her in the shadows who seems to be warming his hands by the fire? What do you think? How does it pair up? This would make a nice creative writing assignment. Come up with a narrative to go with these things, you know? Because there's little bits and there's little clues, but nothing seems to get tied down closely. Who belongs with whom? Who kicked that chair away from the table to stand up? Is it the woman in satin? Is it the man with the puffy sleeves behind her? Or is it sitting open, waiting for the gent at the door? Is there an answer? It's hard to read. Then it gets weird, right? Because you'll notice the dog between the two of them sees her, maybe he's come in with him. It has a view that neither of the other 2 people in that room have. It has a view of what's going on between the 2 principals, the man at the door and the woman in the satin. Right? The dog can see what's going on. He's looking up at her hands. Right? He's directing our attention to her hands. She's got her thumb like this in her hands, right? Sticking out, making it look very phallic, right? See her thumb coming out from between them?
Actually, this was a thing. This was, at the time, that's how they made like the middle finger.
That, or they made a come on, right? It could be a middle finger, but it can also be like...
No, that's how what came to be the middle finger now. Blah, 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 got his origins. But, yeah, you're right, how they do it.
Yeah. It's also part of making symbols is like, are you interested, right? In this case, it's even worse because she's got her hand like this, and that thumb is coming way the heck out, right, like that. So she's making, and you'll notice that gesture can only be seen by the dog, right, and the man on the left, and not by the other music makers. Right? So we add to that what he's doing. He's making a place to put the thumb, right, with his hand. He's got it like that. So these two things together suggest that the two of them are very much making symbols about erotic pursuits, right? The pursuit of, I want to say love, but definitely love making, right? And on a certain level, that then becomes I think it becomes fascinating when we think about the rest of the picture. Because in the rest of the picture, we have people that are going about the traditional sort of veiled ways of alluding to love, which is musical instruments. And this is like cutting to the quick. Do you want to do this? Right? Yeah. That's what we're up to. Right? And the dog warily looks on as all of this is taking place. Right? Now, there's a, sorry about that. Let me do something here. Fix this. Animate that. Okay. This is a book of emblems that's built around love poems, honorable pastimes, and it was really quite popular. The poet Jan Krul may have been painted by Rembrandt. His portrait may have been painted by Rembrandt. But it has a series of poems all about love, and each one of them has an illustration that goes with it. And this one basically says, the caption at the top of it says, the excess that brings no profit. And what it means is that this is an activity that doesn't really do anybody any good. Right, the excess that brings no profit. And if we look at it more closely, we can see how similar, the National Gallery has brought up this connection, how similar the layout of the scene is to what's going on in Terborch. A man comes through the door, takes off his hat, dog looking at him warily, kind of like the picture we just saw by Metsu as well. And a woman leading him on. And the point of the theme of this is that when women lead men on, when women initiate the courtship ritual, it means they're up to no good in 17th century society. Right? Women who initiate it are after something else. And that's a theme that we saw in a lot of these ill-matched lovers and whatnot. The Quentin Matsys that we looked at 2 weeks ago, where she's tickling his chin, but taking his money, right? Because she's up to no darn good, right? So that's basically the theme of this within this book, is that women who are initiating any kind of courtship ritual are women who are up to no darn good. Now, do you think this is a good comparison? No?
I mean, they do look really similar.
In some ways,
Yes.
right?
But
So-
in other ways, they're not.
In other ways, they're definitely not. So we've got the dog and the guy and a woman in a room with another guy, at least one of the guys, right?
Yeah.
But there's some things that really make it break down a little bit, right? So she's, age differences is one. She looks older in the print. The fact that she's with two men already in the print also problematizes it. She's not actually making music. The lute is there, but it's hanging on the wall. And the print is much more obvious. She's entertaining three men, right? She's initiating this interaction with more than one person. And with the Terborch, it's much more subtle than that, in that we have two couples. Right? And so the analogy begins to break down there in that respect, because there's no way with the Terborch that we should read it in exactly the same way as the excess that brings no profit. That it's not necessarily a woman initiating the ritual in an utterly negative way. The other thing that's come up with this, someone who wrote a book on Ter Borch, felt that the two hand gestures were too subtle, not overt enough to read it that way. I don't know if I agree with her or not. I used to work for her. She was the head editor of the journal that I was an associate editor on. And she certainly knows her way around Ter Borch stuff. She's written 3 or 4 articles plus a book on it. And she doesn't buy it. She just thinks that's a comfortable way to hold your hands. But I don't know, right? I think there's an intrigue to it. I think there's this idea that we had the Metsu, which is that there are things that people know in this image that other people in the image don't know. That there are things that are going on behind the scenes here. But of course, the point of these is that we're not supposed to agree. And that what Ter Borch does, what all of our genre painters do, is they give us clues, but as often as not, they don't codify the answer. Right? Jan Steen gives us one way to look at these things. You've got to laugh along with it, right? And people are being stupid, it's obvious. But with most of our mid-century genre painters, right, Ter Borch and Metsu and Vermeer in particular, there seems to be a concerted effort on all of their parts to make the painting less obvious, to make it more open to independent, alternative interpretations. Right? Now, I did want to look at that extraordinary drapery, right? It's so good. Just the number of the range of colors between yellows and blues that pick up on their way through the different fabrics. Also, the almost pointillist way of painting, the highlights of the embroidery, right, are little dots of paint.
Consistency.
Sorry?
Consistency.
You can see. I mean, you can feel this with your eyes. You know what I mean? You know how thick it is, what kind of body that satin has, right? And it's just, it's extraordinarily beautiful, right? Just extraordinarily beautiful. I get the feeling that these things must have been more expensive for it. I don't know if anybody's done a market study of these, but just the way in which it picks up the brown of the floor, right? Hits on parts of that, the blue coming from the black of his clothing sort of picks up on parts of that. It's slightly pearlescent, right, without actually being pearlescent. And again, it just has this amazing body, right, to it, which is just absolutely extraordinary. We're very lucky. This is one of the best ones. He's got 6 or 7 of these, and they're really just extraordinarily gorgeous, right? It must have been a trademark of sorts for him. When you get up close, though, it looks so easy, doesn't it? It's like, hey, let's add some blue and add some yellow, and there you go. But my goodness, even just as a drapery study, every now and then you just want to pull back and stop talking about symbolism and meaning. That's the nice thing about this. Nobody picks up a volume of Emily Dickinson and say, look at how beautiful the book is, and then spend a ton of time on that, right? We just get into in art history, we can get into the beauty of the object. We saw this one when we were abroad, the parental admonition piece. This one, first, you'll notice it looks like the same guy, and you'll notice the sleeves and the costume is the same as the guy in the background. He used his family to model for him. So the guy is his brother-in-law. His name is Moses, right? And the girl is his sister named Jacina, who was herself an artist and a poet, right? And she appears in lots of his pictures. They're almost always there. The title of this, the one in parentheses, the traditional title, was given in the late 18th century when it was thought to be a father and mother teaching their daughter the right things to do when she goes outside, right? Parental admonition, so instruction, right, on life itself, right? But then people began to look at it more closely and think that perhaps it was an image of prostitution. That we have an older woman with a man, a soldier no less, and the young woman, and that might then be our standard brothel scene, where the old woman peeks out from behind and she's arranging the connection between the two of them. And there's that bed behind them, right? Which isn't there in our picture. Okay? So the prominent red bed ties into that. And with this came up this idea of what's he doing with his hand, right? And I've got a close-up of it, right? He could be making the same gesture as he is in the National Gallery picture. And we don't see her hands, but from the position of her elbows, they are together, right? And again, there's this idea that only the two of them see each other. The old woman is buried in her drink and not paying any attention to what they're doing. But it was thought in the early, mid-20th century that he had a coin in his hand. And when it became obvious he didn't have a coin in his hand, they said, well, it must have just been rubbed out by a later leader, or later owner, right? Didn't like the overtones of the image of the house of prostitution and rubbed it out or painted over. And this went into the conservation studio at the Rijksmuseum, right? Our friend Petria, who we met. And they concluded that not only is there not a coin there, there never was a coin there. And the area is just as well preserved as the rest, and nothing's been painted over or rubbed out. So he's just doing this with his hand, right? He's just making a gesture. Now that could be a gesture of talking, or it could be the gesture we have on the left, right? But there is no coin changing hands here. No attempt to him to be paying for her with that gesture. Right? And when de Hooch wants a figure to pay, he makes it pretty obvious. Right? This is in the Louvre. And there's a soldier's coming, same costume, right? Sword off to the side. We see him from the front, and he's fat and old now. And here he's actually offering her money. Right? And they're very obviously there in his hands. So our picture, the Rijksmuseum picture, doesn't pick up the same theme. That said, it is about courtship, definitely, because if we look at what's on her table, right? It's a mirror with wings that fold over it, so she's been making herself up. There's the brush, right, for the makeup, the powder brush, that we saw the Metsu woman using on her chin. There's a couple of combs on the table here as well. And some ribbon, maybe for tying her hair, right? So she's definitely prepared for him to arrive. Now, what do we do with the candle, the unlit candle? There was one on the floor in the Metsu as well, an unlit candle. People talk about it as a reference to love coming, fire about to be lit by the arrival of the gentleman. Right? But again, there's this idea with Ter Borch that he gives us clues without locking anything down. Right? He wants us to look at these and interpret them. Think about what they might mean as we look at them. But I think what he's treating in this image is something that we saw him treating in ours as well, is this idea of an amorous conversation. And that's definitely part of it, right? Look at the proximity of his crossed-legged foot to her dress, right? There is something going on with this conversation that only the two of them are privy to. And the others around them, they're getting away with it right under their noses. And Ter Borch seems to be playing with that idea in this image. He doesn't do it all the time. Sometimes the woman is in on it too, right? The third figure is in on it too. This is up in Baltimore at the Walters. Another soldier, right? Sitting even closer to her. And in this case, mixing up a glass of lemonade as she stares into his eyes. But again, there's this sense of the dialogue between the two of them, established through gazes and looking. And then the older woman making it appear very much like a prostitution scene. She looks very much like the procuress that we so often see in these. Now, the lemonade, right, was a standard cure for lots of things, but it was usually given to women with morning sickness. And many doctors' visits images by Jan Steen and others show us lemons prominently placed and drink bottles nearby, or drink glasses nearby, with the idea that the woman who's now gotten sick is being given lemonade as a cure for it, also for scurvy and other things. But in this case, it has to do with the fact that she's pregnant, right? And in Jan Steen's images, it's usually the doctors coming, trying to diagnose it. They don't know what's wrong with her, and we all do, right? And we have the lover at the doorway with the servant behind. In this case, the lover's back, and she's feeling ill, and the old woman is saying, "Oh, you're feeling ill," and was treating her, and he's helping now give her the glass of lemonade. He didn't bring it with him, right? The old woman's made it for her. He's just helping her drink it, right? He's there to be part of it. But the point of the picture is that, of course, he's the one who made her sick, right? He's the one who's given her morning sickness, if you will, right? He's the one who's impregnated her. And Ter Borch makes this fairly obvious. There's about 2 or 3 versions of this one, right? Because what he's doing, if you look at what he's doing, first the lighting on their faces, and again, that's his sister Justina, brother-in-law Moses, is he's got the glass, the big goblet, and it's got the lemon in the water. And you can see what he's doing is he's taking his knife and he's jamming it into the lemon, right? So good. And releasing its juices, right? This is a totally Freudian, proto-Freudian sexual overtone, right? Is that he's making it more fragrant. He's making it spit its juices out, if you will, by jamming it with his knife, right? So that's pretty straightforward that way, what he's up to here. But again, Ter Borch wants to nuance this. He wants to make sure that we look at it and then we think about other possibilities, right? In this case, the man has the coin in his hands. This is that Baburin picture that's up in Boston, and the woman is. I want the coin on the hand, and the woman is dressed much more obviously as a prostitute, picking up on these things. So many of our genre scenes from these different masters that we've been looking at give us these different ways of interpreting them, right? And that's what we'll see when we look at Vermeer. Is the case for Vermeer's work as well. And that's who we'll spend the rest of class with, is looking at Vermeer, because he's really terrific, and we'll look at more than just the stuff from the few museums that we've been to get this point across. He started his career in the early 1650s, only painted for about 20 years total, right? And there only survive around 40 pictures all told. And for the longest time, we thought that he was distracted by other business concerns. He ran an inn. So did Jan Steen, and there are hundreds of Jan Steen pictures, so that doesn't seem to be what got in the way, if anything got in the way, right? He also had something like 14 kids over that period of time, right? Poor wife. And so there's a possibility that was an issue as well. What's come up more recently, and by more recently I mean in the last 20 years or so, someone went back and did a lot of fairly extraordinary archive research and found out that of the 40 Vermeers that are still around, right, 25 of them were in one collection in the middle of the 18th century. And they could trace that collection back to someone who would have known Vermeer. And through a very complicated web of archival documents, what came up is that it seems that there was this patron who paid Vermeer a retainer to have the right of first refusal, and amassed a massive collection of Vermeer pictures that he would keep together as one group. Right? And they stayed together for about 100 years after Vermeer's death, until they got dispersed all around. So he had a prominent patron. And when you have a situation like that, that means you have a bit more luxury, right? You can paint more at will and explore themes differently that Vermeer started as a history painter. We've talked a lot about history paintings in this class. We haven't seen as many as we've talked about, right? Remember that history painting encompasses Bible, mythology, historical scenes, and this was the most important kind of painting, right? Was elevated in status in the minds of patrons and artists because it required more knowledge, more skill on the part of the artist than other kinds of painting did. So for many artists, this was the way to go. Vermeer, his earliest works, there are 3 of them, from the early to mid 1650s, are all history pictures. We saw one on the left in the Moritz House. The one on the right is in Edinburgh, right? And they show us both a mythological scene, and a biblical scene. And they're fairly large as well. These are meant to be important pictures, right, in Vermeer's work. We don't know the attrition rate of Vermeer's pictures, but of the ones that survive, 1/10 of them are religious pictures, and they're all early in his career. Right? Did he do more before he shifted to become the genre painter that we know? I don't know. Right? What caused him to become a genre painter? Was it the patronage of this collector that wanted something from him? Right? But he definitely began his career as a history painter. Yeah. Attrition means what's fallen away, what's disappeared, what's been chipped away at. That's what attrition means, to chip away at. So we don't know how many Vermeers we've lost, right? There are records to 3 or 4, but there aren't records to a lot, right? The interesting thing about Vermeer is that 15 years later in his career, give or take a few years, he painted an allegory, an image that is about the status of painting, about the art of painting. It's not a self-portrait. If it was meant to be a self-portrait, we'd see him from the front, right? It's an artist painting in the studio. And what he's painting is the muse of history, the figure that inspires history. So he's ostensibly saying, even now, 15 years later, 15 years into painting nothing but genre scenes, that history painting is still the best, right? History painting is still what we aspire toward, right? So this is an important element of Vermeer. And what we find is that he shifts from these early history pictures to genre pictures. Now, what else do we know about Vermeer? His mother-in-law, his wife's mother, was related to a painter from Utrecht. We haven't looked at him before. We sort of skipped over him. But he's from the same time period as the Utrecht Caravaggio people that we did talk about, Abraham Blumart, right? And there is some possibility, no smoking gun, but there's a distinct possibility that Vermeer studied under Blumart. And that's how he met his wife, since Blumart is related to his wife's mother. Think about Rembrandt's artistic activity and how it led to his wife, right? So that makes some sense. In addition to that, Blumart, he does some Caravaggio-inspired works, but he's really known for these sort of elegant figures in extraordinarily bright and primary colors. And Vermeer picks up on that and continues it throughout his entire career. If you just look at the color range and the poses and whatnot in the Vermeer image, comparing it back to this historical scene by Blumart, I don't know if he would have known this particular picture, right? But this is the legacy from which he comes, right? So this is his background. Starts as a history painter, seems to have studied under somebody from Utrecht, maybe Blumart, before diving into his own career as a painter, right? Indeed, Blumart, when he's doing works of art that are more obviously Caravaggio-inspired, right? That also brings something into Vermeer's work. There is a soft falling of light that tends to obscure things in many of his paintings that seems to have come out of a knowledge of the Utrecht Caravaggio group, right? Even though he doesn't start painting until 30 years after that. We also know that he owned this picture on the right. Now, not only is the one on the left one of his first genre scenes, a revision of that composition, right? So there's the procuress on the right asking for the money. In this case, she's leaning in from the back. The man holding the coin, now in red, right? Quite obviously procuring a relationship. He has hand on her breast, his thumb on the coin. We have a lute in the background versus the lute in the foreground. The figure on the left who's there drinking with them, we think might be a soft portrait. There's no proof of this, right? But most people think it's a soft portrait, right? And the Baburin picture, while being sort of translated into this early genre scene, is also in the background of other Vermeer pictures. It's on the wall on the right there, behind the piano, the harpsichord, if you will, right? So, do you see it up there in the upper right corner?
This picture on the left looks just like the picture we saw above the doorway in the genre scenes.
Oh, the Hoke. It does the one above the woman in yellow.
Yeah.
It
The trees are like in the same place.
with two exceptions. One, the scale is wonky, right? Those were pretty small by comparison. And two, I think that if we go back, I'd have to go back and see them side by side. But you're right, it's a sort of standard landscape composition. But those ones also, I think, two things. One, I think they were wider. This one's pretty square, right? They were more horizontal. And the other thing was that they seemed to have a source of light in the trees to suggest that it was a nocturnal scene. Go back and look, right? But, of course, the pictures within the pictures are crucial for us, right? They're always important. And what's fascinating is I'm really kind of fascinated by the landscape behind the figure on the left. See the setting sun falling behind the columns in that opening in the picture on the left. But in both of these, right, okay, so we've got a landscape behind her. We have another one on the lid of the harpsichord. And we have a procuress image. And all of those things add into the meaning because we've seen a lot of these landscape pictures have images of lovers walking through the landscape, particularly on musical instruments, right? Now, we don't see that here because the fellow in the concert, the man on the chair, is blocking whatever might be there. This is typical Vermeer, right? Complicating the message, making it more difficult to read. But he still gives us quite obviously an image of a procuress, right? An image of prostitution. So there's a link between two kinds of love here, right? One more traditional, more respectable, and one less so in this picture, right? But it reminds us that Vermeer, once he makes the shift over to genre pictures, is drawing on other traditions. And as we look at Vermeer's pictures, what we find is that his genre scenes, while Vermeer's terrific, I mean, he's just an amazing painter, and images have extraordinary timelessness to them. And he's one of the people that you teach 17th century Dutch art and you choose two people, one of them might be Vermeer. You know, it'd be Rembrandt and Vermeer. But with Vermeer, despite that legacy, that he's never not been popular, right? And even though he has just a few pictures out there, 36 pictures out there, once he starts to do genre scenes, the genre scenes he starts to do are extraordinarily traditional. And what makes the Vermeers special is what he does with the tradition. So every image that he paints in the genre category falls into a well-established, long-standing tradition. And Vermeer, in the act of painting, ends up doing things to make it a little strange, to make it a little different than what other people had done. So this is also one of his very, very early genre pictures. Right around 1656 or so, he seems to have shifted to genre painting wholeheartedly, or almost wholeheartedly, right? The one on the right is in the Met in New York. Part of the surface is fairly badly abraded, so there's an upended jug in front of the white picture that is almost worn away, right? The finish is missing up. tipped up. And you can see with both of these, he's got this artifice of the carpet that's on the table, which was normal, but it's bunched up in the foreground, so that we can't really see beyond it, right? It sort of blocks us. And in fact, with the girl asleep, I really kind of like the way in which he does this a lot. He gives us these intimate interiors, but he separates us from it. He gives us visual blockage. So with the Procurus, for example, we have all this stuff piled up that don't allow us easy access in. All of our other genre pictures, right, we could walk right in. There's a space for us to wander on into the picture. But here, it's blockaded, right? And we have not only the table, but we also have that chair blocking our entrance in. I checked to see, it's not exactly the same pattern, but it's close. There are elements that repeat in the carpet. That chair is in about a half dozen or a dozen Vermeer pictures, with the lions' heads on the side of it, right? The map in the background is in a lot of Vermeer pictures. The painting above her head is in a lot of Vermeer pictures. Right? These are objects that he seems to have owned and included and re-included in his pictures. Now, of course, this is a common theme, right? The maid asleep with work to do and not paying any attention to it, right? In this case, a table to clean up, to straighten up, and she's not doing it. And so it is a tradition that was around, and when Vermeer turns to genre, he picks up on what's going on in genre. He doesn't reinvent the wheel. He doesn't come up with new types. What he does is he comes up with new approaches to old types. Right? And so his picture is very much like the Moss in that it's about an undutiful servant. We get little clues as to how to read it. That glass jug upended, right? Precarious situation. There's a whip for beating the dust out of the carpet, lying unused, right? There's a mostly drank glass of wine in the background, suggesting why she's fallen asleep, right?
So maybe the wine gave like a hint to why she was sleeping.
It certainly colors it in that it's not just a quick nap, right? That makes the nap sinful, if you will, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it makes it like forbidden naps.
That's right. Now, what's going on up here? It's hard to see because it's not dark. You can look at. That's we can identify the picture. That's Cupid seen from the back, with a theatrical mask at his feet. So we see the heel and the leg.
I actually can kind of see it.
Yeah. So that's the back of the shin, right? That's the calf muscle of Cupid. We see the heel from the back, and because it's Cupid, that suggests something else that we can read into it, right? That another reason that she's sitting here asleep is that she's been entertaining somebody, that there's been love involved, right? And this is the aftermath of that, and she's now neglecting her duties. And this is the kind of fascinating thing. This is the last thing we'll look at. X-rays. I love looking at these things because they tell us what's different about the X-ray. Can you read it? Look at the doorway. There's someone in the doorway. Look where the mirror is. That's a mirror on the far wall of the side table. In this, there's a guy in a hat. Can you see him back there, sort of ghostly? So when Vermeer started this picture, it was a very obvious thing, right? She has had an affair, he's left, right? And she's fallen asleep, not doing her work. He's made it much more obvious. In fact, all of those Moss pictures of eavesdroppers and servants asleep had to do with the idea of they're neglecting their duties to do something physically pleasurable, right? The other thing you can see, it's even more obvious, see the dog? Standing in the bottom of the doorway down here. He's got his back to us. He's looking at the guy back here. Can you make him out down there? Right? So there's the top of his head, his ears, floppy ears. There's the back, and there's the haunches. Right? There's the foreleg. So what Vermeer did with the image as he was working on it, right, is he started off with something that was very straightforward, very obvious, really one way to read this only. And as he was working, he decided that he was going to open up the meaning. He was going to get rid of the stuff that made it obvious and unidirectional. Right? and he was going to change it to make it a little bit more nuanced, more open-ended, right? And what I don't know enough about, but I'd love to find out more about, is whether that was unique to Vermeer. Was it unique to this picture? Does he do that all the time? Change things. One of the things that this is interesting for us is that there's an ongoing question about whether or not Vermeer used an artist's aid, whether he used a box camera and had built a structure with an aperture and a lens and had it project onto a canvas that he then just traced, called a camera obscura. And there's a lot of literature out there that discuss this question. Did Vermeer use the cheat, right, in doing this? And there's a lot of things in his pictures that suggest that he knew what they were all about, right? But the changes that he makes while he's painting suggest that there's more to it than just tracing, right? That as he's working, he's changing his mind. He's moving things out that way and removing things and wiping them out. And that's not what you do if you're just tracing, right? That's engagement with the subject matter over the course of time. Okay, on Friday we'll look at the rest of the Vermeers, and that'll be that. And you've all got more work you're doing already, I saw, for your other classes. So good luck with all of that. You've all got your comments back on your papers. If you didn't get comments, if for some reason I didn't get your paper back to you, let me know, because I'm sure I sent it back to everybody. No, I saw yours in my outbox when you were in my office.
The other one.
The other one, which other one?
First one.
With the list of pictures.
No. Like our first lesson.
Oh, the one for, but yeah, you don't have that one. I'm talking about what you need to do your revision.
Oh, you never showed that?
Not
Yeah,
yet.
I don't have any grades for the class. I don't know if I do.
You got some grades for the class. You got grades for the.
For the draft, that's the count.
Yeah, it does. No, look at the. Yes, it does. It all counts. But yes, I know I'm behind on that. I'm planning on this weekend while you guys are working on your last paper to get all your other grades back.
I don't know how much I need to compensate for that.
Well, the important. Let me tell you this.
Do my best.
I know that's you should always do your best,
I
right?
always do my best.
But here's the thing: nobody's in a position to be worrying too much.